Whether you realize it or not, you have seen transformers around you all of your lives. You certainly have plugged in devices like this or like this, these large boxes that are on the end of our cords. If you were to look inside, you would see coils of wire that form what is called a transformer. This is also a transformer. Usually they're surrounded by high fences that say don't go in, okay, because this is also transforming voltage, so it's more appropriate for our homes. What a transformer does is it changes the voltage level and then also the current, but it maintains a constant level of power. And so it provides the right amount of electrical voltage and current for a particular situation. Typically, the transformers we encounter in our everyday lives are going to be what are called step-down transformers. This means that it takes some sort of input voltage, typically our 120 volts from the wall, and it provides a lower output voltage. In this case, you can see from this adapter that it goes from an input of 120 volts to an output of 12 volts. This is, it seems as though we're losing something, and that we've lost a whole bunch of voltage. It's gone down by 10 times. But if we look more carefully, you'd find that the current increased by 10 times. So the power value ends up staying the same at the input and the output end. There are some terms that are used to describe different parts of a transformer. The words input and output are common, as are primary and secondary. Primary comes first and secondary comes second. This diagram starts to hint at what's inside a transformer. There is a core, often made of iron, that links two different coils of wire. The coils themselves don't actually touch. It is just this core that transfers sort of the power from one side to the other. And we're going to look at how that works in just a second. But it's important to recognize that transformers are not producing power. They are just converting power from one level of voltage and current to a different level of voltage and current. This is a formula that you may want to write down on your note card, that the primary power and the secondary power remains the same, meaning the voltage times the current for each side of the transformer remains the same. A transformer takes advantage of two different aspects of electromagnetism. There are moving charges, meaning a current that produces a magnetic field, and then there's also a changing magnetic field that produces an electric current. Let's take a closer look at what happens inside a transformer. So on one side of the transformer, this would be our primary side, you can see these red wires that are wrapped around a core. Those wires determine how that voltage is going to be stepped up or stepped down compared to the blue coils. But the key thing is that this would be connected to maybe your wall outlet or something like that. That is going to determine or going to allow charges to flow through those red wires. And those moving charges would have magnetic fields around them. And so there would be a magnetic field set up within this coil, just like with a solenoid. But that magnetic field will sort of transfer through this entire core. And so on this other side, where the blue is, there's going to be a magnetic field within that blue coil. So inside that blue coil, that magnetic field would produce an electric current in the wire as long as the field is actually changing. You don't get an electric current if the magnetic field is steady. You have to have a changing magnetic field. And that's why it's vital that these sorts of transformers use AC or alternating current rather than DC or direct current. So our wall outlets are a perfect source of primary voltage and current for a secondary coil. So in the previous picture, we saw how there were different amounts of coils, the red coils versus the blue coils. That ratio between those two numbers of windings or coils times that you wrap the wire around the coil, that determines how the voltage is adjusted. And so you can think of this formula, which again you should jot down into your onto your note card. You can think about this formula as sort of talking about the output compared to the input. And if you look at the way the voltage changes, the coils, the number of coils changes in the exact same way. Let's take a look at the two main types of transformers, step down and step up. So a step down transformer, you can see, goes from a high value of voltage to a low value of voltage. The voltage is stepped down. If we were to compare these two, we can compare the out to the in, and we would see that the output is 200 volts versus the input being 1000 volts. And this exactly matches the ratio between the turns. The red side has 10 turns and the green side has 50 turns. So either way, there's a 1:5 ratio between the output and the input, or the secondary versus the primary. But notice that the power value stays the same. So power is voltage times current, V times I. And so if we take a look here, on the left side, the primary side, there's 1000 volts and 2 amps of current. And on the right-hand side, or secondary side, we have 200 volts and 10 amps. And so we could have predicted one of those by using that sort of conservation of power idea. There's 2000 watts of power on both the primary and the secondary side. If we take a look at a step-up transformer, on the output side, or the secondary side, there are 400 volts across the wires versus only 100 on the primary side. And if we look at the turns, we see that same 4:1 ratio, 20 turns versus 5 turns. But again, in terms of the power, 100 volts times 10 amps, or 1000 watts, is the same as 400 volts times 2.5 amps, again 1000 watts. So step down will lower the voltage as you go from primary to secondary, but it will increase the current. So you gain current, but you lose voltage. Step up, you gain voltage, but in the process, the current goes down. The term down and up always will refer to the voltage, not the current. It's pretty cool, all the things that these transformers can do. If you looked at the flow of electricity from the power plant to our homes, you would see that the power plant steps the voltage up using a transformer. It's transferred along wires at a very high voltage that turns out to be more efficient. We'll talk about that later. And then when it comes nearer to our home, it goes to a substation where it is stepped down to a more reasonable value, but still pretty high. And then as it gets closer to our homes, either overhead wires or underground, there's another step down to bring it to that 120 volts that our home uses. And then, of course, in our homes, our individual appliances might step it down even further.